Long before American soldiers stormed the beaches of Europe, long before tanks rolled through ruined cities and flags were raised over liberated ground, the Second World War was already being decided in a place most people never think about when they imagine war. It was not decided in a single battle, nor by one brilliant general, nor by a heroic charge under fire. It was decided quietly, methodically and relentlessly inside factories that never slept, inside systems that never hesitated, and inside a nation that understood something fundamental about modern warfare long before its enemies did. While dictators bet everything on speed, intimidation, and fear, the United States was building something far more dangerous. It was building scale. It was building coordination. It was building an industrial and technological force so vast that, once fully unleashed, it would be impossible to stop. This was not improvisation. This was planning executed on a level the world had never witnessed. Steel flowed like water. Electricity never went dark. Machines were not repaired when they failed. They were replaced. And behind every rifle, every truck, every aircraft, there was an invisible system ensuring that another one was already on the way. For years, German soldiers had been taught that war was a contest of discipline and engineering superiority. They were raised to believe that precision would always defeat numbers, that quality would overcome quantity, and that American society, with its openness and comfort, could never sustain a prolonged, disciplined war effort. This belief was repeated in classrooms, reinforced in training, and amplified through propaganda. It was not merely a military idea. It was a cultural conviction, and for a time, it seemed to hold true. But then the war expanded beyond Europe, and when it did, the rules began to change. As German units were captured and transported into Allied custody, many of those soldiers were not inexperienced conscripts. They were veterans, men who had marched across Europe, men who had endured artillery barrages, freezing winters, and the psychological strain of prolonged combat. They did not consider themselves defeated in spirit. In their minds, they had been overwhelmed temporarily, not surpassed fundamentally. They expected captivity to confirm what they already believed, that America was powerful, yes, but inefficient, disorganized, and dependent on brute force rather than mastery. What they encountered instead would quietly dismantle everything they thought they understood about the war. When these prisoners arrived at American-run camps, there were no dramatic displays of dominance, no theatrical brutality, no chaos. What struck them first was something far more unsettling: order. The camps functioned with calm efficiency. Supplies arrived on schedule. Infrastructure worked. Electricity flowed without interruption. Food was consistent. Equipment was standardized. Guards were disciplined, not frantic. There was no sense of urgency, because nothing appeared to be in short supply. Day after day, the prisoners observed a reality that contradicted years of deeply held belief. Trucks arrived endlessly, forming convoys that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Machinery was abundant, functional, and quietly replaced when worn. Radios operated without constant repair. Generators ran continuously. Administrative processes moved smoothly, without confusion or delay. To men trained to respect engineering above all else, this was deeply disturbing. They began to realize that what they were witnessing was not merely wealth and not merely production, but control. Control over materials, control over logistics, control over time itself. This was not a nation scrambling to respond to a war. This was a nation managing it. And in that realization, something fundamental began to crack. For the first time, many of these prisoners understood that courage and discipline, no matter how deeply ingrained, could not overcome mathematics. That bravery could not defeat an enemy capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. That precision, no matter how refined, was meaningless against a system designed to absorb damage without slowing down. This was not a battlefield advantage. It was a structural one. The war, they began to understand, was not being fought evenly. What unsettled them most was not what they saw in moments of action, but what they saw in moments of routine. There was no desperation, no frantic adjustments, no visible strain. Everything worked as if the outcome were already known, as if the system itself had accepted victory as an eventual certainty. And slowly, silently, the idea took hold that the war had been lost not because Germany had failed on the battlefield, but because it had chosen the wrong kind of war to fight. By the time this understanding fully formed, it was already too late to change anything. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, that initial unease among the prisoners deepened into something far more profound. It was no longer just surprise at American efficiency, but a growing awareness that they were standing inside the machinery of a different kind of war. A war where battles were only the visible surface, and everything that truly mattered happened beneath it. The routines of the camp became a daily lesson in scale and inevitability. Nothing felt rushed, because nothing needed to be. Every process seemed to anticipate the next, as if the system itself was thinking ahead. For men who had been trained to believe that war was won by decisive blows and superior tactics, this was a psychological shock. German military doctrine emphasized precision strikes, rapid advances, and concentrated force. It relied on the idea that a smaller, more disciplined army could defeat a larger one through speed and mastery. That philosophy had brought early victories. It had reshaped Europe. But inside those camps, the prisoners began to understand the hidden cost of that approach. Speed without sustainability, precision without redundancy, brilliance without depth. What they were seeing in America was the opposite. Redundancy everywhere. Multiple solutions for the same problem. Backup systems layered on top of backup systems. If a machine failed, another replaced it. If a route was blocked, 10 others existed. If a shipment was delayed, warehouses were already full. The American war effort was not fragile. It was resilient by design. This realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, often in moments that seemed insignificant at the time. A prisoner assigned to work near a supply depot noticed that inventories were tracked meticulously, with quantities so large they were difficult to comprehend. Another observed how standardized parts allowed equipment to be repaired or replaced without delay. Others listened to guards discuss logistics with a calm confidence that bordered on indifference. There was no anxiety in their voices, because shortages were not part of their reality. Slowly, a terrifying conclusion began to form. Even if every American mistake were exploited, even if every tactical advantage were seized, the system would simply adapt and continue. The war could not be won by outthinking an enemy that had already outproduced, outplanned, and outlasted every possible scenario. For many prisoners, this was the moment when hope truly collapsed. Not because they feared death, but because they understood futility. The idea that the war might turn again faded, as they recognized that the conflict was no longer symmetrical. Germany was fighting a war of exhaustion without the means to sustain it, while the United States had transformed exhaustion into a weapon against its enemies. This understanding carried a heavy psychological weight. Soldiers are trained to endure hardship, to face fear, and to survive chaos. But they are rarely prepared to confront inevitability. The prisoners began to speak less about victory and more about survival. Conversations shifted from strategy to speculation about the post-war world. What would remain? What would be rebuilt? What kind of nation could emerge after facing an opponent like this? Some of them began to reflect on earlier moments in the war, searching for the point where things had irreversibly changed. Many would later point to the moment the United States fully mobilized its economy, when factories once producing consumer goods were transformed overnight into engines of war, when innovation was no longer isolated, but coordinated, when science, industry, and logistics were fused into a single purpose. In those reflections, a painful clarity emerged. Germany had prepared for a brilliant war. America had prepared for a long one. And in modern warfare, duration is destiny. By the time this truth settled in, it no longer felt shocking. It felt obvious. The prisoners did not need intelligence reports or official announcements. They could see it in the endless movement of supplies, in the calm precision of operations, and in the quiet confidence of a system that never appeared strained. The war, they understood, was being won far from the front lines, in places they would never see, and against forces they could never confront directly. And that knowledge, once understood, could not be undone. As this understanding settled among the prisoners, it began to reshape the way they interpreted everything around them, including their own past experiences on the battlefield. Battles that once seemed decisive now appeared almost irrelevant in hindsight. Victories that had been celebrated felt hollow when measured against the overwhelming reality of American capacity. What they were witnessing in captivity reframed the entire war. turning it from a sequence of engagements into a story of systems colliding, where only one side possessed the depth to survive prolonged pressure. For many of these men, this realization produced an unexpected internal conflict. They had dedicated their lives to the belief that discipline, sacrifice, and technical excellence would always prevail. To accept that these qualities were insufficient was not just a military admission, but a personal one. It forced them to confront the possibility that their defeat was not the result of mistakes made at the front, but of a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of modern power. In quiet moments, they began to understand that American strength did not come from individual brilliance alone, but from coordination on a national scale. Engineers, factory workers, logisticians, and soldiers were all connected through a system that rewarded efficiency and adaptation. Innovation did not remain isolated. It was immediately absorbed, replicated, and deployed. Every improvement multiplied itself across the entire war effort. This was not a nation relying on heroes. It was a nation relying on processes. The prisoners could see this reflected even in the smallest details of camp life. Procedures were consistent. Equipment was standardized. Nothing depended on a single person's expertise. If one individual was removed, the system continued without disruption. This was deeply unsettling to men raised in a military culture that often revolved around exceptional leaders and elite units. Here, individuality mattered less than integration. The system was designed so that no single failure could threaten the whole. As this perspective took hold, many prisoners began to view the battlefield itself as a kind of illusion. A necessary stage, perhaps, but not the place where outcomes were truly determined. Battles were no longer moments of decision, but expressions of decisions already made elsewhere. Factories had already committed resources. Supply chains had already calculated replacement rates. Training programs had already anticipated losses. The front lines were simply where these calculations became visible. This understanding stripped the war of much of its former drama. It replaced emotion with inevitability. And inevitability is one of the most powerful psychological forces a human being can face. Once the prisoners accepted that the war could not be reversed through effort or sacrifice, their relationship to it changed permanently. They were no longer participants in a struggle whose outcome was uncertain. They were witnesses to the final stages of a process already set in motion. Some of them would later describe this as the moment when time itself seemed to accelerate, not in the sense of chaos, but in the sense that the future became clear. Defeat was no longer a possibility. It was a timeline. A matter of when, not if, and against that certainty, resistance lost its meaning. What made this realization particularly difficult was that it came without violence. There was no explosion marking the moment of truth, no dramatic announcement, no sudden collapse. It emerged slowly, through observation, repetition, and the quiet accumulation of evidence. And because it was discovered rather than declared, it was far more convincing. In this silent confrontation, the prisoners were not defeated by weapons, but by understanding. They had come face to face with a form of power that did not rely on fear or intimidation, but on stability and continuity. A power that did not need to prove itself loudly because its results spoke quietly and consistently. And in that silence, the war revealed its true nature. With this understanding firmly in place, the prisoners began to reinterpret not only the present, but the entire trajectory of the war itself. Events that once seemed like turning points now appeared merely symbolic, while moments that had gone unnoticed at the time took on immense significance. The opening of new factories, the expansion of rail networks, the standardization of equipment, and the seamless coordination between civilian industry and military command emerged as the true milestones of the conflict. These were not dramatic scenes fit for propaganda posters, yet they carried more weight than any single engagement ever could. The realization was unsettling because it challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about strength and victory. The prisoners had believed that wars were won by bold decisions and decisive action, by men willing to take risks and endure hardship. Yet here was evidence that the decisive actions had taken place years earlier, in planning rooms and production schedules, long before the first shots were fired. The battlefield, they now understood, was the final stage of a process that had already reached its conclusion. What made American power especially formidable was not just its size, but its flexibility. The system they observed was capable of absorbing mistakes without collapsing. Errors did not compound into disasters. They were corrected, analyzed, and prevented from repeating. This capacity for learning at scale was something the prisoners recognized as extraordinarily dangerous. It meant that even setbacks strengthened the system over time. Failure was not terminal. It was instructive. This stood in stark contrast to the rigidity they had known. In systems where perfection is expected, failure carries unbearable weight. It demands blame, secrecy, and denial. In America's war machine, failure was openly confronted and rapidly addressed. The prisoners could see how this openness accelerated progress rather than hindering it. Innovation did not stall under pressure. It thrived because of it. As the months passed, the emotional response to this realization shifted from shock to resignation. The prisoners were no longer angry or defiant. Instead, many displayed a quiet acceptance that bordered on detachment. They spoke less about returning to the front and more about what the world would look like after the war ended. Reconstruction replaced conquest in their thoughts. Survival replaced victory. This change was not born of despair alone, but of clarity. Once the illusion of parity dissolved, emotional extremes lost their grip. There was no longer a need for bravado or denial. The prisoners had seen the full structure of the opposing force, and they understood that it was not something an army could outfight. It was something a nation had built over decades, drawing on its culture, its economy, and its capacity for coordination. In moments of reflection, some prisoners acknowledged that the true strength of the United States lay in its ability to mobilize without losing balance. Civilian life did not collapse under the weight of war. It transformed to support it. Universities, industries, and communities aligned toward a shared objective without being stripped of their function. This integration of civilian and military effort created a depth that no battlefield victory could erase. By this stage, the prisoners no longer needed daily reminders of American capability. The conclusion had become self-sustaining. Every observation reinforced what they already knew. The war was no longer a contest of will. It was the final phase of an imbalance that could not be corrected. And with that acceptance came an unexpected quiet, as the struggle that had once defined their lives receded into something distant and irreversible. By the time the war approached its end, the prisoners no longer needed news from the front to understand what was coming. The outcome had already settled in their minds long before the final offensives were launched. It lived in the quiet certainty they carried, born not from rumor or propaganda but from months of observation. They had seen how a modern nation could turn coordination into power, how planning could outperform improvisation, and how systems designed for endurance would always outlast those built for speed alone. For many of them, this realization left a deeper mark than any battle they had fought. Combat had been loud, chaotic, and fleeting. What they witnessed in captivity was silent, consistent, and permanent. It reshaped their understanding of strength itself. Strength was no longer defined by aggression or discipline alone, but by the ability to sustain effort without breaking, to adapt without losing direction, and to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. When these men eventually returned home, they carried stories they rarely shared. Not stories of suffering or violence, but stories of comprehension. Stories of the moment they understood that the war had been decided far from the front lines, by forces too large and too organized to confront directly. They had seen the future of warfare, and it did not belong to those who fought hardest, but to those who prepared longest. World War II is often remembered through its most dramatic moments, through images of destruction and heroism that dominate history books and documentaries. Yet beneath those moments lies a quieter truth. The war was won by the side that understood modern conflict as a problem of scale, coordination, and time. A side that recognized that victory begins long before soldiers ever meet the enemy. History is not always decided in moments of noise and chaos. Sometimes it is decided in silence, through preparation that never seeks attention and systems that never seek recognition. The men who realized this too late understood that they were not defeated by weapons, but by a form of power that did not need to announce itself. That quiet understanding marked the true end of the war for them. And it is there, in that silence, that the real story of victory was written.